High Commissioner Susannah Goshko begins her role in Canada as the world grapples with some major problems, from supply chain challenges to tackling climate change to the growing power of China. The High Commissioner sat down with Power in Politics this morning for her first Canadian interview. And here is the first part of that conversation. High Commissioner, first of all, welcome to Canada.
Thank you.
So we've got a lot of bilateral issues to talk about, but first of all, because it's just your first few weeks here, I understand you've been studying French. How's that going?
That's true. The Foreign Office rightly decided it's really important our High Commissioner to Canada speaks both English and French. So I did speak French about 20 years ago, but I haven't spoken it since then. So I've been having some refresher lessons, and it's great, with the one challenge that the Canadian French accent is a little bit different.
It is a little bit different, yeah. Is it like getting back on the bicycle, though, for the most part?
Yeah, although it turns out to be harder to learn French when you're in your 40s than it was in your 20s.
Absolutely. On sort of the many issues that we see, there is one that has been playing out over the last few weeks in the UK, and this involves these supply shortages. We see them with fuel trucks. And there's a lot of speculation that this is connected to Brexit. Is this one of those unintended consequences?
Well, no. First of all, I should say it isn't, if you're referring to the fuel shortages, it isn't actually a shortage of supply. It's caused by a big demand, an increase in demand at the fuel pumps. And then what we do have is not enough truck drivers to deliver the fuel to be able to refuel those stations in enough time. And there's a lot of things that go into that. The trucking workforce is an aging workforce, so we've got a lot of people retiring. But also the COVID pandemic has had a huge impact. We've got a backlog on applications to get trucker licenses. So it's a mixture of lots of different things, and the government's taking a number of steps now to try and address that.
Is the effective removal of thousands of truck drivers from the UK because they basically can't work there anymore, is that one of those factors?
Well, no, the Transport Intelligence, which is a research site that looks into exactly this kind of thing, has said that there's a shortage of truck drivers across the whole of Europe. In fact, I think their latest statistics suggest that there are 400,000 shortage across the whole of Europe. So this is not a UK-specific problem, and it's a combination of a lot of factors. And
if there is such a shortage right across Europe, why then offer temporary immigration permits for people to come in from elsewhere in Europe? Well, if it's a problem that's being experienced pan-Europe, then where are those people going to come from?
Well, the government's doing a number of different things to try and attract people in. So one of them, as you said, is offering temporary visas. But we're also asking those people who were truck drivers who retired if they might come back. We're increasing the number of, we're putting 10 million into recruiting 3,000 new truck drivers and speeding up the processing of those applications that there's already a backlog for. So there's a whole package of measures there now, which is aiming to put this on a much more stable footing.
Is there a concern in any part of the government that Brexit is having unintended consequences, be it on supply lines, on labour shortages? Is there a concern that some things that were perhaps not foreseen are now playing out?
No, I think that as the government looks at this, we're really conscious that we're in a unique moment at the moment, and the pandemic has had impacts on every country across the world. And as I said, one of the things it's done is slow down the processing of driving license applications for truckers. And so I would say it's a complicated question, but it's a number of factors, and the pandemic is really probably one of the principal ones.
Brexit, though, has preceded 1.3 million workers who had been in the UK to leave, and to leave primarily for the European countries that are still part of the EU, to which they return, or perhaps to another country that is still within the Union. Is that not a potential factor when you have that many people out of the labour force leaving all at once?
Well, again, the government's looking at all of that, particularly in the food and farming sector. For example, we're having conversations now with those industries about what we can do to increase the attractiveness of those industries to domestic workers. So there are conversations going on about pay and progression and training so that we can have a really good, stable domestic supply of workers to enter those areas so that we don't face this problem in the future.
Leaving the common market with Europe has now prompted the UK to start seeking trade deals with other countries, and Canada is one of them. Of course, we've just come through an election cycle here, and for Canadians to begin negotiations on a trade pact, as I'm sure you know, there has to be a notification to Parliament. But with Parliament not having been sitting over the course of the summer and then the election campaign, that whole process has been delayed. Is that a disappointment to the UK?
No, we're confident that this is going to receive attention and is going to move forward in good time. I mean, when we look at this, I think about what my priorities were when I was preparing to come out here, and growing those economic and commercial links between Canada and the UK has to be one of them. We both know that trade and investment is key to recovering the economy after the pandemic and creating jobs and growth in both the UK and Canada. And so both countries will be putting a lot of effort into doing that.
What is a reasonable timeline for that to now occur, to ink a deal?
Well, I'm not going to put a timeline on it, but I hope that we're looking at our mandate at the moment, and I hope we'll be beginning a conversation next year on how we take this forward.
Early next year?
Let's say early next year.
Okay, because the negotiations have yet to begin, but I think there's hope. Certainly the UK government has expressed that. There were some reports last week that suggested the UK was interested in joining this successor to NAFTA, CUSMA, or it's called different things in different places. But is that actually a real thing? It seemed in some ways to have perhaps been a distraction to domestic issues that were going on in the UK.
I think that what I can tell you about that is that we've got a trade continuity agreement in place with Canada, and that's working well for now. That gives us a strong basis from which to build a free trade agreement. And we're also seeking accession to CPTPP, which is the trade agreement that covers the Trans-Pacific region. And so we'll be prioritising that as we move forward on trade.
I certainly want to talk about CPTPP. I'm going to press hold on that conversation for a moment, but lots to talk about, including China. One of the issues that we share in common right across the entire world, of course, is climate change. The UK has put in what appear to be more aggressive targets compared to Canada. Where does the UK see what Canada is now proposing?
Well, I think we were really delighted with some of the announcements that Canada made earlier this year. So the raising of ambition on emission reduction from 30% to somewhere between 40-45%. That's exactly the kind of ambition that we need to see countries showing. And also doubling of your climate finance commitments. Both of those are critically important as we look now to COP, which is being hosted in Glasgow in November of this year, and which is an inflection point for us now. There's a really important challenge ahead on climate, and so we're really pleased that Canada has stepped up its ambition on both of those.
Now, even stepping up its ambition is still a lower number than most other countries, including your own. You have set targets that are significantly higher than Canada's. How does the UK see it's going to accomplish that? Because it's one thing, of course, to make promises, it's another thing to deliver.
Yeah, well, it's not going to be easy, but we're taking serious steps on it. And we were, in 2019, the first country to write into our legislation our ambition to reach net zero by 2050. So that's now in law. And there's a number of steps we're taking, including, for example, reducing coal. But for example, we're going to be producing in the coming days a strategy on zero emissions vehicles, because transport accounts for 17% of all global emissions. So there's a package of measures going into that. And we have, of course, already reduced our emissions by 45% over the last 3 decades. So we're confident we're going to get there.
China is a big component to the climate change discussion. And much of the Western world has relied on China to build, and we have in some ways exported the pollution that we create to China. And yet China relies still very heavily on coal-fired power plants and on heavy emitting industries. What are the areas that you see China needing to be held to account on its own climate change ambition and emission goals?
Yeah, well, you're right that China is the largest emitter in the world, and so we really do need to think about tackling that if we're to tackle the mitigation gap between those commitments we need to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 and what's already been pledged. China is a complicated question because they're simultaneously the world's largest emitter, but they're also the largest investor in renewable energy, the largest domestic market for zero emissions vehicles, the largest consumers of solar powered energy. So there's a lot that we need to think about, and we need to think in particular about how we get them now to commit to really ambitious emissions targets. We welcome President Xi's commitment that they'll try and be at net zero by 2060, but we need really to be talking about the detail that underpins that. But at the same time, there's some things happening there with those use of renewable energies that we need to be thinking about how we learn from for the rest of the world as well.
You've worked in very senior positions in the Foreign Office in the UK, and so I think I can safely assume that you understand diplomacy very well. China is a big, big player in this world, one of the biggest perhaps. And there is a question essentially on a whole series of files. How do you put pressure on China on some areas and not drive them away, but also get them to engage on things like climate change, which require worldwide action?
Well, you've put your finger on the heart of the question. So I think what I would say is that China's assertiveness, international assertiveness, is probably the sort of big geopolitical shift of our generation. And we all have to think about how we respond to that. And so that means that there are a number of things that we absolutely need to work with China on, climate change being one of them. And we want a positive and constructive relationship with China. But we also need to be clear-eyed about how we go about doing that, and we need to do it in accordance with our values and thinking about our own security. And so one of the things we need to be saying to China is that we recognise their influence in the world. But if you want to be a world leader, that comes with international obligations, and we expect China to live up to those. And so those are the conversations we need to be having.
Those discussions can include things like arbitrary detention, which Canada has been dealing with for, well, more than 1,000 days with the two Michaels. That chapter is now closed off, but I certainly want to talk to you about that. And we'll do that when we come back a bit later on Power and Politics. Well, last hour we brought you part of our exclusive interview with the UK's new High Commissioner to Canada, Susannah Goshko. She starts her job at a time of heightened uncertainty around the world. One area of shared concern between our two countries is, of course, the rise of China. And that's where we begin part 2 of our face-to-face interview. High Commissioner, I want to continue on our discussion about China. And we have come out of a very dark chapter in Canadian-Chinese relations with the arbitrary detention of the two Michaels. During that time, it seemed that Canadian foreign policy towards China was on ice, that itself was being held hostage. What do you expect Canada can now do relative to China with this file somewhat being resolved?
Well, first of all, I'll say how delighted I am by the return of the two Michaels. I know from my time in London how much our Foreign Secretary really cared about that case and spoke regularly to your Foreign Minister about it. And one of the first things I did when I arrived in Ottawa was attend the 1,000-day march to mark the fact that they had been in detention for 1,000 days. And so we're really pleased now that the two Michaels are home, and I recognise that that puts what's been a very difficult chapter for Canada behind it. I imagine that, I can't speak on behalf of Canada, but I imagine that Canada's policy towards China will be very similar to ours, and that's to say to seek a constructive relationship, but to do so in a very clear-eyed way about what's in our interests and what's in line with our values.
The US has, of course, appointed an ambassador of the United States to Canada, and that person is yet to take up their post, but one of the things that they have asked for is for Canada's policy on China to be made clear. And they say they're still waiting. Are you still waiting for Canada's policy on China to be clear?
No, I think that every time we've wanted to work with Canada on an issue around China, we found that it's worked extremely well, and we found that the UK and Canada have worked well together on this. So by way of example, a couple of things we've done recently on China. So the UN-led discussions, the UK-led discussions at the UN to hold China accountable for abuses of human rights in Xinjiang, and Canada was right alongside us in support of that. And we've also recently brought in human rights sanctions for those same things that we've seen in Xinjiang. Canada's taken the same steps. So I think that we would say we work very well with Canada on China, and that we see our approach to China as very similar.
There are some areas where we are not yet in step, and one of those is Huawei. We are part of the Five Eyes intelligence network, Canada and the UK, players in that, but every other partner has banned Huawei from their 5G cellular network from being involved in that. Is it time for Canada to make a decision on that?
Well, I think every country has to take their own decisions on this. So I imagine that the conversations are happening about how you take that forward. It's a very complicated question, and it's one of those ones that I think might just take a bit of time to work its way through.
What concerned the UK about Huawei?
So I think that we recognise that Huawei has an important presence in the UK, but the conversation was the same as the one here around the security of our networks and how we protect the security of our networks. And ultimately, we think we found a solution that does protect the networks and allows Huawei to continue operating.
One area that we talk a lot about China is CPTPP. And there is a question about whether an agreement that was in some ways designed originally by the Obama administration to, if not isolate China, then create a gathering of like-minded nations that would counter China's influence, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. China wants into that agreement. Should it be allowed?
Well, as you know, we've applied to join CPTPP, and we're excited about the opportunities it affords. As an accession country, it wouldn't be right for us to be commenting on other countries' accessions to the agreement. But I would say that what we like about the agreement, there's a number of things, but one of them is that the rules it has around things like labour standards and unfair state practices, those are the sorts of things that are at the core of how we see international trade. And so we're keen to become a member because we think that we can comply with those rules and be part of upholding them.
Taiwan also wants into that trade deal. And of course, there are frictions, to say the least, between Taiwan and China. Should Taiwan be permitted to be part of that arrangement?
Well, again, I'm going to give you the same answer that as an accession country, it's not for us to be commenting on other countries that are seeking accession.
Then let me ask you, is it important for Western nations to look at Taiwan, to defend Taiwan's interests, and to support the sovereignty that it enjoys now?
Well, I think it is important for Western nations to stand with other countries. I think that, and particularly think about those things that are happening in China that concern us.
There are, of course, a whole series of other issues around China, and one of them is in terms of pushing back against China's influence. The recently announced pact, AUKUS, which is an odd-sounding term, I've got to say, Australia, the US, and the UK, and this is primarily about nuclear-powered submarines to start.
That's right.
Is this an exclusive arrangement? Is this something that Canada could potentially be a part of?
So, just to give you some background to this, the UK published something called an integrated review earlier this year. And that set out how we see our defence diplomacy and development policy over the next 10 years. And in that integrated review, we were clear that we were going to be looking to conduct a tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. And that's for a number of reasons, in part because of some of the geopolitical competition, the intensifying geopolitical competition in that region. And so this AUKUS pact, which is, as you say, in the first case about the provision of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, is really just a development of what we set out in our integrated review. Australia has one of the largest maritime domains in the world, and it's really important that Australia is able to protect and defend the security of that domain, and it's in all of our interests that they can do that so that region is stable.
I am fairly sure Canada's maritime domain is larger than Australia's. So if Canada let me ask you this, was Canada asked to participate?
Well, your Prime Minister has said that at the moment you're not interested in purchasing nuclear submarines. So I think that question is perhaps not the right one now because Canada's not interested in it.
But there's a difference between Canada saying it's not interested and Canada being asked to be part of it.
Well, the Australians came to us with the ask. So the genesis of it was that the Australians came to the UK and said that they were interested in acquiring nuclear-powered submarine capability and could we help them? So that's why we're working with Australia on this. I should say we are doing a lot with Canada. For example, one of the things that we're doing is we're cooperating with them on the provision of future warships for Canada. And so that's driving military cooperation between the UK and Canada. It's creating jobs in both countries. And of course, we remain committed to the Five Eyes Agreement, which is really critical to all of our security.
A number of people who feel that China presents an existential threat to the life that exists in Western countries. Would you share that view?
Well, I don't think I want to be drawn on whether China presents an existential threat. I think the key thing, to bring you back to what I said earlier, is that we need to work in a constructive way with China. China is is a world leader. It has rights and responsibilities in that regard. But critically, China has to be part of the solution to any problems that we're facing, in particular, things like climate change. We won't be able to solve them unless we work with China. So I don't think it's helpful to us to be labelling them as existential threats. I think the important thing is finding a way that we can work together, being clear-eyed about what that means.
And yet, as you talk about sort of re-centering a lot of your posture towards that Indo-Pacific region, China is the major, the growing, the dominant player in that region. What is the end game for China in your assessment?
Well, I think China, as China thinks about what it wants to do in the world, it does want to show world leadership, and it does want to be a player on the world stage. And so for us, the important thing to do is to find a way for them to be able to do that that does take into account their responsibilities and international obligations.
China is not the only nation that Canadian foreign policy is focused on. Iran certainly is one of them, and it's more than 20 months ago. What many people view as a mass murder carried out in the air, Iran shooting down Flight PS752.
Yeah.
There were 55 Canadian citizens on that, 30 permanent residents. And there were also 4 Britons on board that plane. There have been a whole series of claims and demands issued by nations that had passengers on board. And one of those things includes, in June of 2021, Canada, the UK, and allies filing a notice of claim to Iran.
Yeah.
Has Iran responded?
So, as you'll know, there's been a change of government in Iran over the last few months. And one of the things we need to do now, and we're talking with Canada about how we do that, is to encourage Iran to have negotiations about how we take exactly that forward, about how we hold Iran to account and get some justice for the victims and their families.
What does justice look like?
Well, there are a number of things in that notice of claim that you mention. For example, we're asking for a full account of what happened, so there's transparency. We're asking for a return of missing belongings. There's a number of different things at play there, and they're all set out in that notice of claim. The key thing now is to move forward with a discussion with the Iranian regime about how we actually deliver on those.
So moving forward with the discussion means it's got to be on the agenda. Your new Foreign Secretary, Liz Truss, met with Iran's foreign minister on Monday of this week in New York. Right. She tweeted that she pressed the minister on detained British nationals and on Iran returning to the nuclear deal. Was the shooting down of PS752 on that agenda? Was it discussed?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer, but I do know that we regularly talk about this, and as you say, along with Sweden and Canada.
Regularly talk to Iran about this.
And we try and do it in concert with that group of allies that you just described, because we think there's a lot of power in doing that together. And so that's a group of countries that have been affected by this terrible incident. And what we've tended to do is put out joint statements together, because we think that brings extra weight to what we're asking for.
Canada absolutely has a responsibility to continue to push Iran. Iran has the greatest responsibility here, without a doubt. But unlike Canada, the UK has diplomatic relations with Iran. What is the UK doing to try to push for accountability right on the ground in Tehran?
On this issue of the plane?
PS752, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid I can't tell you exactly the steps that our ambassador there has taken, but I'm pretty confident it will have been part of the discussions he's having. And as I say, we've been really clear in the statements that we've put out as part of the international group that we think that it's really important that there is accountability and justice for this. And the notice of claim sets out exactly what it is that we're looking for.
I mean, it seems 20 months have gone by, and like there's people in this country who don't have their moms and their kids and their dads. Entire families have been wiped out. Is there any prospect that they will get any further recognition from Iran? An apology recognizing what happened, financial compensation, return of belongings? I mean, it's a long, long list.
Yeah, it is.
What are the odds of it?
It is. Well, look, I mean, my heart goes out to the people who lost people on that plane. It is a really tragic set of circumstances. And I think all we can do now is to continue to act together with allies to stress to Iran how important this is and how much it will mean to the families of those who lost people to make some progress on those issues. We need justice and we need accountability.
High Commissioner, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.